welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week, as we look to the feast of Christ the King, we're going to look at Luke's account of the crucifixion of Jesus and what that tells us about who Jesus is and God's reign, God's kingship. Before we get started on any of that, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet accompanying this study. You'll find the link in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, verses 33 to 43. As I've already noted, we're in the story of Good Friday, and this reading for Christ the King focuses on Jesus' crucifixion and also the interactions that he had with the two thieves who were crucified with him, one on either side. Now we know that opposition to Jesus had been building over time, and in particular since he'd arrived in Jerusalem at the beginning of what we now call Holy Week, various other Jewish religious leaders had been seeking out ways that they could kill him. So you might look, for example, at chapter 20, verse 19, or chapter 22, verse 2. But we're told that they'd been kind of held in check by Jesus' popularity with the crowds, until, that is, Judas betrayed Jesus into their hands. Now, the setting of today's passage is called the Skull, or Golgotha. It was a place on the outskirts of Jerusalem that was used for crucifixion, on the outside of the city walls, because it was believed that having dead bodies in the city would be unclean, would be contaminating. And it was also by the municipal rubbish dump. So it doesn't say very much about the people who were crucified there. And indeed, it's important to note that crucifixion was a method of Roman execution that was reserved for people like Jewish citizens. It was never used on Roman citizens, and it was used on men rather than women. And it was designed to humiliate its victims, crushing them not just in body, but in mind and spirit too. So contrary to many of the artistic depictions we see of the crucifixion, Jesus and the two thieves who were crucified alongside him would have been stark naked when they were on the cross after being scourged beforehand. So in this passage we have Jesus obviously coming to the end of his earthly life and offering a decisive vision here of what God's reign means and looks like, having completed his long purposeful journey towards Jerusalem. We've got these two anonymous thieves, one crucified either side of Jesus, one of whom rejects Jesus and joins in the scorning and mocking of him, but the other of whom recognises something of who he is. We'll say more about that later on. We're told that there are large crowds of people in this scene, and they include some of those Jewish religious leaders who it seems have conspired to have Jesus put to death. And they mock and scorn him, telling him, well, if you really are the Messiah, the Christ, God's chosen one, save yourself. And finally, we've got the Roman soldiers, those who actually crucified Jesus and who also joined in the mocking of him and cast lots for his clothes. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written, around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and it forms volume 1 of a two-part work, along with the Book of Acts. Its crucifixion account contains elements in common with Mark and Matthew, the two earlier canonical Gospels, but there are elements that are unique to Luke and not found in either of the earlier ones or indeed the later text. Now, it's very helpful as we move through this text to keep in mind a range of others that illuminate what we find here. What I'm about to offer is by no means a comprehensive list, but it's I think, a useful set of possibilities for you to consider. So the first of those is an earlier Jewish work preceding the events described in Luke's Gospel. It's Wisdom, chapter 2, verses 13 to 20. And in that we find a passage describing the mocking of the Messiah who dies a shameful death. So there's a kind of prefiguring almost of what we see with Jesus. As we read through today's passage, we get the echoes of Jesus' own predictions of his death. In Mark's Gospel, in chapter 8, verses 31 to 33, chapter 9, verses 30 to 32, and chapter 10, verses 32 to 34, we get these three predictions that the Son of Man will need to die and then rise again 3 days later. And they're echoed by Luke in chapter 9, verse 22, in chapter 9, verses 43 to 45, and latterly in chapter 18, verses 31 to 34. Now, I mention all of this because Luke draws out, really, Jesus' long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, and there's a much more detail there than we find in the earlier Gospels. And indeed, that whole travel narrative, as it's known, runs from chapter 9, verse 51, through to chapter 19, verse 27. But we can go back even earlier in Luke's Gospel for a significant text to chapter 2, verses 33 to 35, when the elderly prophet Simeon is talking to Jesus' parents about him and saying that he will effectively lay bare the true heart of the people of Israel and cause the rise and fall of many. That text, I think, really looms large in today's passage and the different reactions to Jesus. Now, if we look just a little bit before we come to today's text, if we look at Luke 23, verses 1 to 12, we discover that Pilate is the one who gives Jesus this title, King of the Jews. And it's a title that Herod the Great, who also features in that section, desperately wanted for himself. It's important to keep that in mind. But if we jump forward to Acts chapter 2, verses 37 to 39, we see how what's described in today's passage was not the end of things. And we see the enlargement of God's promises of mercy coming about through the sending of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. So there's a lot of background here, and as I say, this is far from a comprehensive list of things you might want to look at. What we can say is that the horrific scene is set for us in verse 33, when Jesus is crucified alongside, as I said, these two anonymous criminals whose exact offences are not disclosed to us. And they're in that terrible place, the skull, outside the city of Jerusalem. Now, verse 34, where Jesus says, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing," is probably one of the most famous verses in the whole of the New Testament. And yet many of the earliest manuscripts of Luke's Gospel don't actually contain it. So if you look, for example, at the NRSV, this phrase is in brackets to indicate that. But whether it was a later edition or whether it just somehow got missed out or what happened in the textual development, it does solidly fit in the narrative and Jesus' interaction with the figure who's become known as the penitent thief. We're told in verse 34, in the bit that all the ancient accounts do agree on, that the soldiers who crucified Jesus cast lots for his clothes. And there's an echo there of Psalm 22, verse 18. Indeed, there's many echoes of that psalm in how the crucifixion narratives of all the Gospels are shaped. That detail is noted across the board. Now, we're told at the beginning of verse 35 that the crowds stood there watching, apparently silently. I think it reveals quite a lot about that aspect of human nature where we can see something going on that we know in our heart of hearts is wrong, is not just. And yet we keep quiet, we stand by. There's something very powerful in that, I think. The people who don't keep quiet, as we learn in the latter part of verse 35, were some of the other Jewish religious leaders who scoffed at Jesus and mocked him and said, well, if you're the Messiah, if you're God's chosen one, save yourself like you saved others. So he's being scorned from that direction. Verse 36 tells us that the Roman soldiers who gave Jesus some sour wine, which was a kind of painkiller, also joined in the mocking him. And verse 37 tells us that they used that title that Pilate had given him, King of the Jews, and also challenged him to save himself if he really was deserving of that title. Now we're told that there was an inscription set above the cross of Christ, and it was printed in Latin and in Greek and in Hebrew, by which we basically mean at that point Aramaic. And that inscription calls Jesus the King of the Jews. If we look to John's Gospel, to chapter 19, verses 19 to 22, we learn that Pilate was the one responsible for writing this sign and in all likelihood put it there in these different languages to try to provoke the Jewish authority figures with whom, let's say, he had quite a frosty and difficult relationship. Now, as we see in verse 39, the first of the two thieves who speaks joins in the mocking of and the condemnation of Jesus, demanding not just that he save himself, but that he saves the two of them as well. But while we learn more of what the second man has to say, it is worth pausing to note that all these figures who deride Jesus, the religious authorities, the Roman soldiers, and that first thief, inadvertently use various of the titles that apply to Jesus: King, Messiah, Son of God, God's chosen. But they don't do so with sincerity. The second thief, who begins to speak in verse 40, however, very much does so. He notes that while him and the first thief to speak were subjected to the same condemnation as Jesus, they had been justly sentenced in his view. They deserved it. But as we learn in verse 41, Jesus had done nothing wrong. Now, it's not clear how the second thief came to know that Jesus was innocent, but he makes that very clear statement. And when he uses another of those titles for Jesus in verse 42, as I say, he does so with a sincerity that we've not seen so far in that episode. And his request to be remembered when Jesus comes into his kingdom echoes Psalm 106, verses 4 to 5. And it leads, as we learn in verse 43, to his salvation. The use of the Greek word semeron, from which we get our term sermon, means today. And it occurs at various points within Luke's Gospel, always when salvation is emerging. So we might look, for example, at chapter 2, verse 11, or all the way forward to chapter 19, verse 9, for other examples of that. Now, the term paradise, paradisio, comes from the Jewish literature of the day. Jesus has adopted that term, and it refers to eternal bliss of one dwelling with God. And it's a remarkable outpouring, if you think about it in this instance, of undeserved grace. The thief does not repent of his sins or explicitly ask for forgiveness, but nonetheless, in his heartfelt appeal to Jesus, we see him being accepted into God's kingdom. It's been a source of argument among biblical scholars for a long time as to whether the penitent thief's behaviour sets the pattern for us to follow as modern day disciples, or whether more is required of us as we respond, not being as short of time as the thief was. So there's a lot going on in this passage. Coming at it immediately before we dive back into the season of Advent and begin a new church year has admittedly a slightly surreal kind of feel about it. But nonetheless, we get a powerful glimpse into what it means to talk of the reign of God. It's not something that meets our standard expectations, and it's one where grace pours forth even amid scorn and derision. With that thought in mind, we now turn to our questions for this week.